Good morning. I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily update for November 4th, 2021. Well, it's clear that the frustration is building among the leaders of the COP26 conference underway in Glasgow. The frustrations are building because they're finding that it's difficult to con most of the world's population into accepting conditions that will kill them. And as a result, they're relying on measures of financial bullying, what they accuse China of doing. They're preparing possible military enforcement of countries that don't abide by the agreements they reach at the conference. And they're patting themselves on the back in the process. Take, for example, Joe Biden. Now, here he is, a man whose party just suffered a massive defeat in the governor's elections in New Jersey and Virginia. They won New Jersey by a tiny margin, but they lost Virginia. And they lost it because their policies are terrible. They're doing nothing to fulfill the promises they made. And in the meantime, they're going around pushing the most rabid green, anti-industrial, anti-science policy of any country in the world. And in coming back from the conference yesterday, what did Biden do? He attacked China, Russia, and Saudi Arabia for not being at the conference. He said China especially is losing the ability to, quote, influence people around the world, unquote. He said the same is true with Russia. As for the U.S., Biden said that his presence at the summit is having a, quote, profound impact, unquote, as the rest of the world is, quote, looking at the United States and its leadership role, unquote. I wonder who told him that. Now, obviously, this is a talking point which makes no sense. His handlers were happy that Biden didn't fall asleep during his speech at the COP26. Now, more realistic is a comment from a leader of the Heartland Institute, Steve Malloy, who said Biden's comments are, quote, a sad indication of his failure to grasp real-world realities, unquote. A polite way of putting it. But he added that neither Russia or China, quote, has any interest in hamstringing its own economy with destructive climate regulations, unquote. Now, even Greta Thunberg stormed out of the proceedings yesterday during a panel on financing. She accused the leaders of pretending to take the future seriously, but not doing enough. This hero of social media, the Fridays for Future leader, the person who has been granted by the media the right to lecture world leaders on the climate, demonstrated her eloquence after she stormed out of the meeting by telling the media, quote, no more blah, 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 no more whatever the F they are doing at this summit, unquote. Now, there is a lot of hot air at the summit, a lot of blah, 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 but it promises to do what Greta wants, to eliminate fossil fuels and achieve net zero carbon, no matter how many people have to die in order to do this. The true purpose, though, did come out yesterday of what this conference is about. It's about the Great Reset. It's the parallel policy of the Green New Deal and the transformation of the global banking system into a top-down banker's dictatorship, controlling credit and spending. Now, this became clear in a press conference given by Mark Carney, the former director of the Bank of England and also a leading muckety-muck in the United Nations green policy. Carney announced that Sir Michael Bloomberg, the former mayor of New York and failed presidential candidate, who's spending some of his billions of dollars to promote the elimination of coal burning, that Bloomberg has agreed to co-chair what they're calling the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero. They say now they have 450 financial institutions that have joined the compact, and they represent more than $130 trillion in assets. Now, what is this? The compact is a group of financial firms which are agreeing that they will restrict credit from going to any company that has a carbon footprint. Now, initially, that means no funding for energy research, no funding for exploration for oil and gas, no funding for coal-fired plants or anything of the sort. But over the long term, they intend to cut funding to almost all industrial processes, including those that make materials for construction, for infrastructure such as concrete and steel. It's essentially a compact for credit strangulation of the productive economy. Why? So that all those trillions can continue to go into a bubble, this time a green financial bubble. And that's exactly what Carney was talking about. Carney has said there will be $60 trillion of this fund, minimally, maybe even $80 trillion, that will be available for investment. And where will it go? It will go into stocks. It will go into derivatives. It will go into so-called green energy, which is inefficient and unsustainable despite all the propaganda you're hearing coming out of the Green New Deal proponents. Now, the British Chancellor of the Exchequer, Sunak, when he heard this, described this as an historic step. And he announced plans to make Britain, quote, the world's first net zero aligned financial center, unquote. No big surprise there. This is the City of London's baby. This was put forward initially by Prince Charles with his underling, Klaus Schwab. Some of you think Klaus Schwab is running things. He's running things on behalf of Prince Charles and the City of London. The Davos group includes some of the leaders of that, but also a lot of just the handmaidens who are out there promoting these policies for the sake of personal greed and corruption. Now, what will this fund do? We got an example of it in the case of South Africa. South Africa is a country that relies almost entirely on coal and increasingly was moving toward nuclear power for electricity production. But they announced an agreement with the COP26 powers that the US, the UK, and the European Union will provide a fund of $8.5 billion to form the, quote, Just Energy Transition Partnership, unquote. And the purpose of this partnership is to, quote, accelerate the decarbonization of South Africa. What does this mean? It means putting an end to fossil fuel use, putting an end to investment in nuclear power, and forcing South Africa to rely entirely on so-called sustainable forms of energy, wind and solar in particular. This will catastrophically handicap the South African economy, as you do have an industrial base there, which requires cheap and abundant electricity, which you cannot get from solar and wind. In fact, Museveni, the president of Uganda, in an op-ed he wrote before the COP26 conference, titled his piece, quote, Solar and Wind Force Poverty on Africa, unquote. So as you hear the language coming out of the COP26, keep in mind that the problem they're facing, which they know, which they realize, is that a promise is one thing, actually doing it is another. And what we saw in the elections this last Tuesday is that the main issue voters are responding to is the economy. And if you have an economic policy which will shut down physical production, which will increase the inflation of goods and products that people need, including food, gasoline, utilities, and so on, that if you do that, you're not going to have support. And you're going to need military power to crush the opposition, which is why there's discussions underway of NATO and U.S. military enforcing these policies. Why do you think Lloyd Austin says the greatest threat facing America is climate change, and the U.S. military has to restructure itself to deal with it? Now, I'll be back tomorrow with some discussion of some very significant strategic issues, including General Milley telling the Congress that he is convinced that China is building for preparations to invade Taiwan. There's the whole question of hyperinflation, the Federal Reserve saying they're about to taper. So we'll get back to that, but let me leave you with this thought, that the COP26 conference is the FLOP26 conference. It's not going to work. It's going to increase the desperation, and we're going to see lurches in that direction, probably alongside various kinds of strategic false flags that put us back into conditions of war. So thanks for joining me today. And by the way, when I say all this, I'm not trying to depress you. We can fight it and we can defeat it. And that's what the Schiller Institute is going to be discussing on our November 13th and 14th conference, an online conference. You can register for it at theschillerinstitute.com. See you tomorrow.